Hey everyone, and welcome to Learn with Dr. Emily. This is a live chat today with Elisabeth Neely, and we are going to be talking about sensory safety for neurodivergent learners. For those new to me, I am a licensed child psychologist in North Carolina. My doctorate is in school psychology, and I'm also the parent of neurodivergent kids. So I've been on this journey in parenting 18 years and professionally over 20. And I love having these discussions to, talk through lived experience, but also what we know and what we've noticed about children in learning environments. So, Elisabeth, welcome, and please introduce yourself to everybody.
Hi, well, I'm Elisabeth Neely. I come at neurodivergence both personally and professionally too. I have, I grew up with an unidentified visual impairment, which is very likely to be cortical visual impairment. Haven't had a formal diagnosis because I don't know if that's available for adults. Um, but then I also am a special education teacher. I have a master's in education with an emphasis in special ed. And then I taught special ed in public schools for 10 years before starting my business, Neely Learning Community, of which my Substack, practical neuroplasticity, is a big part.
Yeah, and Elizabeth
So,
and I met each other on Substack, and I was just saying before we went live that sometimes when people write, it feels like they're in your brain because you're thinking they're writing like how I think, and that's how I felt about Elizabeth's writing. So I wanted to make sure to introduce y'all to her, especially her feedback and perspective on special education and being in the classroom. So if you didn't see Elizabeth's blog from earlier this week, please go look for it. It is a wonderful, beautiful, in-depth look at sensory safety in the classroom. But I just wanted to go deeper into that and ask you to explain a little bit about when you were a teacher. When did you
mhm.
first start noticing that sensory safety was important?
Well, I noticed I didn't really know it was sensory safety for a long time.
Mhm.
But when I started teaching, my very first year of teaching, my kids would get really frustrated sometimes, and no one around me really understood why. And I realized I had kind of an intuitive understanding of what was going on with them, and I would change things. But it wasn't, and that was as a resource room teacher. But
Mhm.
it wasn't until I transferred to a self contained special ed classroom with kids who had much, much higher needs that it really became apparent because they were obviously uncomfortable all of the time.
Mhm.
And I remembered what my experience in school was like, being uncomfortable all the time. And I knew that it was traumatic potentially. And so I
Mhm.
just wanted to help them feel comfortable. So I'd give them like pencil grips if they didn't like how pencils felt. And we'd agree on cues that I would give them if they, to let them know I wanted to talk to them. And it helped. And I thought it was just going to help them, feel at ease at school and make it a more pleasant experience.
Mhm.
But what actually happened was that their motor skills improved, their language abilities improved, they became happier, their social skills improved. And I wasn't working on any of that.
Right. That's
And
what's
so
so
I was just
fascinating about
like,
this.
"What is going on?"
Yeah, and I think people get a little hesitant when all the professionals that I know, we talk very openly about the nervous system and how some people can experience trauma in the nervous system that another person may not experience that as trauma. And I think a lot of people get nervous that we are maybe overemphasizing trauma or making things sound bigger than they really are. But like that's actually the point is that a
Yeah,
nervous system can feel something traumatically that a different nervous system doesn't process that way. And so a neurotypical child without sensory sensitivities may be able to adapt to holding a pencil that feels funny, or they may be able to switch out their writing utensil in any way, and it doesn't impact the speed with which they write or their frustration tolerance. But what you witnessed was, what we all know as working especially with autistic children, but also children with sensory processing and ADHD and just anxiety. They often will have more sensory sensitivities that cause them to use so much energy
yeah,
feeling safe that they have no energy left over for the skills, and I think that's
Exactly.
what you saw. So can you talk a little bit more about this energy management, which I actually spend a whole chapter on in my book that I'm writing, because when you spend energy on safety or processing sensory, there's nothing left over to learn.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, and I experience that all the time with my visual impairment. Um, Cortical visual impairment is also called CVI, and one of the characteristics of that is often visual fatigue, and
Yeah.
it's exhausting. Like I can't function at all if there's any sound and I'm trying to use my vision. And the kids at school, I noticed were the same way. It's like I grew up thinking I was the only one like that, but no, the kids just in lessons, I could sort of see them wilt
Mhm. Wilt
within
is a good
minutes.
word. Yeah.
Yeah. And there'd be sort of just, like, puddles on the table after a while, and but if I, like, toned it toned it down, helping their, um, being a little quieter, making the classroom quieter, giving them partitions so that they weren't
Mhm.
trying to process all this visual stuff, then all of a sudden, they were, like, with me, and I can see the change in the look in their eyes. They just sort of wake up,
Yeah.
and sometimes I wouldn't even know what I did because it was so subtle for me that I didn't realize it was a thing for them. And it's just been in the last 5 years since I've been really thinking about this outside the classroom that I've realized that it was removing overwhelming stimulus
Mhm.
that allowed them to finally become aware of themselves and aware of
Mhm.
me and aware of what I was teaching.
Mhm.
And that makes a huge difference in energy consumption.
Yes, and when I, in my work of working as a school psychologist and then working in private practice where I'm talking to parents and teachers and clinicians kind of across settings, this idea of, energy conservation and energy effort output, like how much gas is left in the tank, basically.
Mhm.
We have to think about individual children because this is very specialized, I mean, individualized to individual children and people, because again, all of our nervous systems are different. But when there are home factors like sleep, sickness, toileting, any kind of stress or trauma at home, just the idea of coming to school, the energy baseline is already different.
Yep.
And then we may have children who, everything in their home life is stable, but they're autistic, for instance. So their threshold is already closer to overwhelm. That window of tolerance that Dan Siegel talks about is much smaller for all of our neurodivergent learners. And I think that this is where we get into as my history with as a school psychologist, we get into talking about behavior, right? So
Yep.
like
Yep.
behavior is what we see when, in my opinion, we haven't supported the
Mhm.
child enough. And, people might come at me for this. However, we have systems in place that I know don't allow teachers to support as much as you want to.
Yep.
For instance, class sizes and low staffing, like all those things are not your fault, but they are things that cause sensory overwhelm. I'm wondering what
Yeah.
you saw as a teacher, what you've reflected on after being out of the classroom that made it harder for you to keep your kids in a sensory safe state.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the last classroom I taught had a cap of 13 students, and I
Wow.
often had 9 to, like, 14 kids,
Hmm.
which doesn't sound like a whole lot, except every single one of them needed one-on-one attention all the time.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's me and 2 staff,
That's a lot for children who need one on one attention.
and they were kindergarten through 2nd grade.
Okay. Yes.
So it was a handful.
Yes. That is.
Um,
Did you have an assistant?
I had 2 full-time
Okay.
assistants, yeah.
But
Yeah, yeah.
still.
But still, they all 9 to 14 needed constant one-on-one attention. And they also had differing needs.
Right.
Like, I had some kids that needed to just be up and moving, and one student was running in circles around a classroom squealing all day, every day. And then I had others who had auditory processing disorder and just couldn't handle any noise. So how do you balance those needs?
Right.
And then I had, there are district requirements about how much inclusion. And at one point, it was all kids get a certain amount of inclusion, which I disagreed with because some of them just could not handle a chaotic environment.
Mhm. Right.
Um,
I think
but
that's something we don't talk about enough is we obviously are all advocates for social inclusion and helping um, all children understand that, a range of humans are a part of this world and should be
mhm,
included. But the exceptions are when it becomes unsafe and when that
yeah,
child is not learning in certain
yeah.
environments. So I would love to hear like how you did accommodate that child that was running around the classroom that was then, exacerbating the other child. That's a question I get a lot from teachers.
Yeah, well, for that child, we just sort of, we just let him run because
Yeah.
he needed, and
Mhm.
just as we could, brought him over and did a little bit, and then he would go back and, that was kindergarten. By 2nd grade, he was able to participate in
Mhm.
academic groups, and it was not a problem. Um, but in the general education setting, it's a little more challenging because there are more kids
Of
and there
course.
aren't many things, and so I would often send the kids with activities that they could do that were in line with the academic, um, activities that the class was doing at the time.
Mhm.
And when I was having conversation with general education teachers, there's a lot of education about, you know, why certain activities in the general education classroom were helpful for the kids and why some of them weren't. And that it wasn't, that they were doing anything wrong, was just this child's nervous system isn't necessarily ready to process, you know, instruction at a distance, and then that's overwhelming and scary.
Mhm.
And so it's not that we're saying that, they don't have the intellectual capability, it's they weren't necessarily ready auditorily in
Mhm.
that setting, but they were in other settings, and so it's finding that match of, what can the sensory systems support? What can the nervous system support? Then that becomes a really productive way of including kids in my classroom, in the general education setting,
Mhm.
where the student is happy, the parents are pleased, the classrooms work really well. So,
Mhm.
yeah, finding that match between what the nervous system can handle and what the
Right.
environment can support.
Yeah, so that, makes me think of, when you're talking to general education teachers, that's one of the main questions that I discuss with them. We, of course, sometimes are starting at behavior and reverse engineering kind of where it went
Yeah.
off and trying to get at where can we prevent this, right? Because there's so much we can prevent by acknowledging that everyone needs to be felt sense of safety, not just in
Mhm.
relationships, but in what they're in the space. And so
Yeah,
one thing I hear from teachers a lot is, I know about relationships. We've got a relationship. It's great, but I still can't get them to do what I need them to do. So I'd love to hear your ideas on the difference between a kid can like their teacher, a kid can feel safe with their teacher, but there's other ways to feel sensory unsafe, like the space and the other children, right?
exactly.
And the
Yeah.
materials. Yeah, I'd love to hear
Mhm.
strategies for supporting those.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the biggest things that teachers can do is to learn to interpret the students' behaviors. Like, what are they looking at, for example? When you're talking to them, are they looking at you or are they looking somewhere else? If they're looking somewhere else, it's probably because they can't process what you're saying and your face at the same time.
Mhm.
And so, if you are able to observe things like that and read what they mean, then you can intentionally plan an environment where they're not having to use their vision and their hearing simultaneously.
Rather than asking them to look at you.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And rather than asking them to look at work while you're talking, because if they can't look at your face and hear what you're saying, they also can't look at their work and hear what you're saying.
That is such a good breakdown because I see that so much, especially with autism,
Mhm.
because some kids process information verbally really well, but if you talk to them at the same time they're trying to read something, they don't get either of them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think it's we are a very hyperverbal society, right? Like, we just
Oh,
think if they're not understanding it, I just need to talk more. And
mhm.
I have had a personal experience when I when I was trained to do DIR floor time play therapy with young autistic children. I had the physical example of this, which is there's a part of DIR floor time training where you don't do for the child, you wait and you slow the pacing and you wait to see how they navigate and you observe. And I had to sit on my hands. Like, I'm a helper, I'm a doer. Like, I had to unlearn a lot of the pacing that I knew and felt as a professional and as a therapist so that I could physically slow down. And I think verbally we have the same tendency just to over explain it or to go ahead and jump in and explain it again. I mean, sometimes my kids have even said, like, you don't need to say it again, I know, but they haven't acknowledged that they know.
Mhm,
So
mhm,
it's hard.
mhm.
It's hard for me to not do that. But that is such a good point that I think eye contact is easy to notice. Like, if a
Yep,
child is not having eye contact with you, they're struggling to proceed, to process that. But the taking in visual work and auditory, I see that so much as well as a challenge. What are your thoughts on just the classroom noise though? Because it's the teacher can definitely alter how the timing of how they are talking to a student. What strategies have you found to be effective for just the classroom noise in kids?
I used a variety of things. I had noise canceling headphones available for anyone who wanted them,
Everyone. Mhm.
for everyone. I also noticed that, if I got the instructional level just right for the kids, both for instruction and for independent work, 'cause I had independent work areas for the kids. They tended to be engaged and they tended to be, less chatty overall.
Mm,
And we also had a lot of community conversations about noise and what's appropriate, and
mhm,
something that might feel okay to you might hurt someone else's ears. And we did that enough so that the kids kind of got to understand that some people just really need it quiet. Of
mhm,
course, every group is different, but, I was usually able to have a pretty darn quiet classroom, by, setting that classroom culture of just
yeah.
but he has different auditory needs, having the noise canceling headphones, and making sure that the work is just right for them, not too hard, not too easy, just really engaging and something they can feel
Mhm.
success.
Now, to figure that out about the just right work, was it mainly your observations or were the kids able to communicate to you, and this of course depends on the child,
Yeah,
when something felt too hard or too easy?
it was both.
Mhm,
Some of my kids were nonverbal, and so, it was harder to know it was harder for them to give us the oral feedback, obviously. Um, it was a lot of observation, especially
mhm,
with really little kids. They can't really know when it's too hard often. So I would look for behaviors like, are they getting silly? Are
mhm,
they getting bored? Is their attention wandering when they hadn't been wandering before?
mhm.
I knew that something about my pacing or the level of difficulty was off. And
Right,
in special education, it was usually that it was too hard or that I had
right.
skipped a step. So
Mhm,
then I started task analysis, what I skip, go back and teach that.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah, you make a good point though, and sometimes it is too hard, but then, whenever I talk to educators who either are gifted educators or who are working with twice exceptional students,
mhm,
there is absolutely a too easy or I already learned this situation
mhm,
for anyone listening that's worked with that child or has that child as your child. I've worked with many kids in my practice who, if they are not, especially with math, if they are not in the right level of math, um, they are so disengaged, and it is
yeah,
so hard to capture their, effort and their motivation. I mean, they just really lose their motivation, and
mhm,
so you're so right, that can show up, dysregulation can show up as silliness or negative behavior,
mhm.
and it's important to pay attention to both, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it can even in, the special education kids, too easy can be a problem because if you've been teaching with neuroplastic strategies and having a sensory environment just right, their learning curve goes way up really fast.
Good point.
And they can sometimes skip skills.
Mhm.
And also even for gifted and 2E kids, sometimes too hard isn't necessarily academically too hard. Sometimes too hard is the sensory environment.
Yes.
And it could be, you know, they might not be able to tell if the material is too easy or too hard if they're straining to figure out what they're looking at or what they're hearing. And so the difficulty could just be adjusting that environment to see if to figure out how they can access their work and then evaluating the
Yeah.
easiness or difficulty.
And don't you find that the older or the more advanced in grade kids are, the fewer accommodations are tolerated? So,
Yeah.
like, if you
Yeah.
have a really intelligent kid, let's say it's middle school or high school, um, we just make assumptions that by then they should not have sensory sensitivities.
Yeah.
But adults have sensory sensitivities, so
Yes.
this is a lifespan thing, so just keeping that open mind is so important, right?
Exactly. And for older kids, what I've often done is I'll have an activity planned for them and I'll do it in 2 or 3 different ways, and I'll just ask them which way is easiest. And I won't use the word necessarily accommodations because a lot of time what we're talking about is just different sized fonts or different styles of fonts or um, different noise levels in the room. And then they give me feedback about what's easiest for them. And then when they're working with me, I just use those environmental conditions. And then once they've gotten experience with that, then I start talking with them about, well, does this still feel good, these environmental conditions? And often they'll say yes. And I'd say, so in your other school or at home when you're doing homework, do you have this? And sometimes they're like, no, not really. I'm like, well, would you like that? And so by giving them experience in a private setting where there's no peer pressure and they can experience how much easier it is, sometimes it's easier for them to transfer it to other settings by choice. And then there's less of a battle because they feel how much easier it is and they just like feeling it.
Yes, thank you for bringing up that point of, like, easy and hard because I learned that phrasing a long time ago from an occupational therapist that was working with my son where, I think we were talking about, the way to hold a pencil, like, way back when he was younger, and, often we get stuck into this, like, this is the right or wrong way to hold a pencil, which is, like, there is no right or wrong way because everyone is different,
Mhm.
but to help kid and she would always, in noticing his body, had figured out probably the easiest way and had observed that and would help him, reframe that to, like, remember to hold the pencil in the way that's easiest for you to write
Yeah.
helping his little young hands at that time get used to that easier way. But I think that's true of teenagers when, we wear out the word accommodations
Mhm.
like you just said, and we try not to use that word all the time because, it's almost become like everyone knows what that is, and there's some sort of, like, unfairness about it that people say, "Well,
Mhm.
you get to type and I don't get to type," but if typing is easier for you and for many people I know that I work with fine or kids and teens with fine motor weaknesses, if your hands can't move as fast as your brain is moving, that's really frustrating.
Yeah.
And, if you can type faster or it's easier to get your thoughts out, that's what we should be doing. At some point, at some point we shift from, always writing to being able to have that easier way to get your thoughts out. Um, yeah, anything else about accommodations you wanted to share?
I think the biggest thing about accommodations is that for them to be really effective, to not just make school easier, but to actually help change the brain, to help the brain have fewer sensory sensitivities, the accommodations need to be just right for the student. And to do that, you need to learn how to observe the student and their behaviors, like I was talking about, like observing, do they look at you when they're talking or do they look away? Which is why I developed my class, Understanding Neurodivergence, which is all about how to apply sensory safety at home and in the classroom
Mhm.
long term so that you can see the shift from chronic fight or flight to learning and growth.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about classroom today, but just in the last few minutes, I wanted to ask you about when parents are noticing sensory sensitivities in the home, whether it's through self-care tasks or toileting or food sensitivities and routine, what are some things that parents can look for that would be your yellow flags or red flags to this child's not feeling sensory safe?
I would say things like if they have a fairly restricted diet, um, that you might consider them a picky eater,
Right.
or maybe they they'll sit and they'll chat at the dinner table, but they won't eat, and they'll eat after everybody leaves. Uh,
Yeah, that's a good yeah, so some kids are, like, really slow eaters or they're fast eaters because they wanna be done with it.
Mhm.
There's definitely a pacing something to notice with eating.
Exactly. So anything that strikes you as, "Huh, that's different," and it doesn't necessarily have to be a lot of things because they're having a richer internal experience than you're seeing on the outside. So if you're seeing 3 or 4 things that make you go, That's a little different," they might be feeling uncomfortable. And it's not that they're necessarily traumatized, but, like we are talking about earlier, there's a larger energy expenditure going on, so they're probably gonna become more fatigued. So especially if you're seeing your kids coming home from school really tired, especially after the first month or 2, especially if they're older kids, like middle elementary school and up, then that's probably a sign that something is draining their energy, and it could be sensory processing and feeling uncomfortable a lot of their day.
Yeah, and I will often use, the visual of just a battery with older
Mm,
kids, not even I mean, even elementary kids to help them start to have some interoceptive awareness of what they're feeling and communicating that, because the sooner we can help them learn to communicate it, adults are not only relying on observation, even though it's
yeah,
both, right? We need to observe
exactly.
and we want to help them be able to communicate as best they can um, for when they're in situations where an adult has missed their cues, because that will
Exactly,
happen if adults
it
don't know
will.
them well.
And also what I have found with sensory stuff is that it's a truly subconscious thing, and there are a lot of things that we just aren't able to be aware of, that we have to observe even in ourselves, observe our own behavior, and rely on other people to observe for us, even if we have really good interoceptic awareness, because, sensory processing is all subconscious.
Yeah.
I didn't think I had sensory issues, even though I was significantly impaired, until I understood what sensory processing was, until I knew characteristics of CVI and I could observe that in myself.
Hmm.
But I still don't necessarily feel it. So observing is a pretty important skill in addition to having interoceptic awareness and being able to articulate what you're
Yes,
feeling.
because we've only all experienced what we experience. We can't I tell
Exactly.
kids all the time, like, I can't jump inside your nervous system and feel it. So, I'm gonna notice your body, your face, your voice, your energy, and those are all giving me clues as to how you're feeling until you're able to tell me more about, and often it
Mhm.
will show up like avoidance or I don't want to do that or shutting down.
Yeah.
But those are, some really obvious observations that something is too much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I want to put a disclaimer here if you are listening and you don't already know that occupational therapists are the providers that specialize in sensory sensitivities, even though therapists like me, educators like Elizabeth, like we all are parents like the people listening, we're all very aware of sensory sensitivities. But if you feel like you're out of ideas or your child needs, extra support, they're occupational therapists that work in schools, they're occupational therapists that work in private practices that can help you understand if your child's experiencing more sensory sensitivities than another child their age. So, Elizabeth, where can people find you if they want to read more or learn from you?
Well, you can find me at my Substack, Practical Neuroplasticity. That's Elizabeth Neely at Substack.com. And I also have my business website, Neely Learning Community. That's NeelyLC.com.
Okay, well, I'll put that information also underneath the notes when we repost the replay of this. But Thanks to everyone for joining live. And also, if you're watching the replay, just make sure you're a free subscriber on both of our accounts and you'll be able to see all the other things that we do. My blogs and live chats are always free. And then I host workshops as well. There is a live workshop today at 12:30 on executive functioning. If you're not already signed up, you can go sign up on my Substack, and we'll be talking about lots of strategies for supporting executive functioning for kids and teens. So, hope to see some of you there. But Elisabeth, thank you so much for joining. And I encourage y'all to all subscribe to Elisabeth's work. Her writing is really informative and helpful.
Thank you. It was so good to talk to you today.
So good to talk to you. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye.